A country of bullet trains, neon cities, ancient temples, samurai, sushi, and cherry blossoms. A place where the future seems to arrive before the rest of the world. But look closer. Behind the glowing streets of Tokyo are villages slowly disappearing. Behind the ancient temples are centuries of political struggle, war, and transformation. Behind the image of the peaceful, technologically advanced Japan we know today is a story filled with ambition, isolation, empire, destruction, and extraordinary survival. For more than 2 centuries, Japan kept much of the outside world at a distance. Then, in just a few decades, it transformed itself from a feudal society into one of the world's most powerful industrial nations. It built an empire. It went to war. It was devastated. And somehow, it rebuilt itself. A generation later, the same country that had been reduced to ruins was producing automobiles, electronics, and bullet trains, becoming an economic powerhouse that helped reshape the modern world. But the transformation came with a price. And today, Japan faces a completely different challenge. Its population is aging. Its rural communities are shrinking. Entire houses are being abandoned. Ancient traditions are disappearing. And the country is once again being forced to answer the same question that has followed it throughout history. How do you survive when the world around you changes? Because the Japan you see today was not created in a straight line. It was forged through centuries of adaptation, crisis, ambition, and reinvention. And some of the most important chapters of that story are the ones rarely told. This is Japan. The story they never told you. Part 1, Before the Japan you know. Long before Tokyo became a city of millions. Before bullet trains crossed the country. Before samurai became legends on screens around the world. Japan was a very different place. Its story begins thousands of years ago. Long before written history, people were already living across the Japanese islands. They hunted. They gathered. They fished. And they created something remarkable. The Jomon people produced some of the world's earliest known pottery, thousands of years before Japan had a centralized state. Their villages were small. Their technology was simple compared with what would come later. But their society was far from primitive. They developed sophisticated tools, elaborate pottery, and communities adapted to the forests and seas around them. Then, sometime during the first millennium BC, another transformation began. New populations arrived from the Asian mainland. They brought agriculture, especially rice cultivation. They also brought new technologies, metalworking, and social structures. And these changes transformed Japanese society. For the first time, wealth could be stored. Land became more important. Communities became larger. And with greater wealth came something that would shape Japanese history for centuries. Competition for power. Over time, political centers began to emerge. One of the most important was the Yamato polity. Its rulers gradually expanded their influence across much of the Japanese archipelago. And from this early political tradition would eventually emerge the Japanese imperial institution, one of the oldest continuous monarchies in the world. But Japan was never isolated from the civilizations around it. Ideas, technologies, religions, and political systems traveled across the sea. China and Korea had an enormous influence on early Japan. Chinese writing was adopted. Buddhism arrived. New systems of government developed. Architecture changed. And Japanese elites increasingly looked toward the Asian mainland for knowledge. But Japan did not simply copy what it encountered. It adapted foreign ideas to its own society. And that pattern would become one of the defining characteristics of Japanese history. Japan borrowed. Japan transformed. And then, Japan made those ideas its own. By the medieval period, another force was becoming impossible to ignore. The warrior class. The samurai. But the real samurai were not the romantic figures we see in Hollywood movies. They were soldiers, administrators, landowners, and members of a complex political system. As imperial authority weakened, powerful military families gained influence. Eventually, Japan's political center of gravity shifted away from the emperor's court and toward military rulers known as shoguns. For centuries, powerful clans fought for land, influence, and survival. And then came one of the most dangerous moments in Japanese history. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was expanding across Asia. Its armies had already conquered enormous territories. And now, they turned toward Japan. In 1274, Mongol forces invaded. The Japanese fought back. Then, in 1281, another invasion came, even larger than the first. Japan faced an enemy whose empire stretched across much of Eurasia. And then, the weather changed everything. A massive storm struck the invading fleet. Ships were destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were lost. The Mongol invasions failed. Centuries later, these storms would become associated with the phrase kamikaze, the divine wind. But the survival of Japan was not simply a miracle. Japanese resistance mattered. So did Mongol logistical problems. And so did the violent storms that devastated the invasion fleets. Japan had survived. But internal conflict would prove just as dangerous as any foreign invasion. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Japan descended into an era of almost constant warfare. The Sengoku period. A country divided between rival warlords. Castles dominated the landscape. Armies marched across the countryside. Alliances were created. And betrayed. And from this chaos emerged three men who would transform Japan forever. Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Nobunaga began the process of unifying the country through military force. Hideyoshi continued it. And after years of conflict, Tokugawa Ieyasu finally emerged victorious. In 1600, his victory at the Battle of Sekigahara changed the balance of power. A few years later, he became shogun. And Japan entered a new era. An era that would bring something the country had rarely known before. Peace. But peace would come with a price. The Tokugawa rulers would build a political system designed to control society, control the warrior class, and carefully control Japan's relationship with the outside world. For more than 200 years, this system would shape almost every aspect of Japanese life. And eventually, it would create one of the most misunderstood chapters in Japan's history. Because the country did not simply disappear from the world. It was watching, learning, and waiting. Until one day, the outside world came to Japan's shores. And this time, it arrived with steam-powered warships. And Japan would never be the same again. Part 2, the country that closed itself. For more than 2 centuries, Japan lived under the rule of the Tokugawa shoguns. It was an era of order, of strict social hierarchy, and, above all, control. The Tokugawa government had learned an important lesson from the centuries of civil war. A divided Japan was vulnerable. So the new rulers built a system designed to prevent another war from tearing the country apart. The samurai were placed into a rigid social structure. Regional lords, known as daimyo, were carefully monitored. Political marriages were controlled. Travel was restricted. And Japan's relationship with foreign powers was tightly regulated. European missionaries had arrived in Japan during the 16th century. At first, Christianity spread surprisingly quickly. But the Tokugawa leadership became increasingly suspicious of foreign influence. Christianity was suppressed. Missionaries were expelled. And Japan gradually restricted most direct contact with European powers. This period is often described with a single word. Sakoku. Isolation. But that description is misleading. Japan did not completely cut itself off from the world. It controlled how the outside world entered. Dutch merchants were allowed to trade through the port of Nagasaki. Chinese merchants continued to arrive. Japan maintained relations with Korea. The Ryukyu Kingdom connected Japan to a wider network of Asian trade. And through these controlled channels came something even more valuable than goods. Information. Books. Scientific knowledge. Maps. Medical ideas. Technological discoveries. Japanese scholars studied the outside world through what became known as Rangaku, or Dutch learning. So while Japan appeared closed, it was still watching. And inside the country, something remarkable was happening. Peace was changing Japanese society. For generations, people had lived with the expectation of war. Now, for long periods, there was no great civil conflict. Cities grew. Commerce expanded. And one city became enormous. Edo. Modern Tokyo. By the 18th century, Edo had become one of the largest cities in the world. Its streets were filled with merchants, craftsmen, samurai, entertainers, and ordinary people. The merchant class became increasingly wealthy. Literacy expanded. Publishing flourished. Theater became a major form of entertainment. Kabuki attracted huge audiences. Woodblock prints transformed Japanese visual culture. Artists captured actors, landscapes, beautiful women, and everyday life in a style that would eventually influence artists far beyond Japan. This was the world of ukiyo-e. And something else was happening. Ordinary people were developing a sophisticated urban culture. Restaurants. Tea houses. Theater districts. Travel. Fashion. Popular literature. Japan was not simply a frozen medieval society. It was changing. But while Japanese cities became increasingly sophisticated, the outside world was changing much faster. Across Europe and North America, industrialization was transforming economies and militaries. Steam power was changing transportation. Factories were producing weapons on an unprecedented scale. And industrial empires were expanding across Asia. Japan's controlled isolation had protected it from many of these pressures. But it had also left the country without the industrial military power that Western nations were rapidly developing. Then, in the summer of 1853, 4 American warships appeared in Tokyo Bay. They were commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry. To the Japanese, these ships were unlike anything they had seen before. They were enormous. They were powered by steam. And they carried modern artillery. The Japanese called them the Black Ships. The message from the Americans was simple. Open your ports. Or face consequences. For the Tokugawa government, this was a nightmare. Japan had spent generations controlling foreign contact. Now a foreign power was demonstrating that it possessed military technology Japan could not easily match. The arrival of Perry exposed a painful truth. Japan could no longer decide the terms of its relationship with the outside world. And the shock did not end there. Other Western powers followed. Britain, France, Russia, the United States. Foreign pressure intensified. Unequal treaties were imposed. The authority of the shogunate began to collapse. And Japanese political leaders faced a terrifying question. Should Japan resist the West? Or learn from it? The answer would transform the country more dramatically than almost anything that came before. In less than a generation, Japan would dismantle an ancient political order. Abolish the samurai's privileged status. Build a modern army. Construct railways. Create factories. And begin transforming itself into an industrial power. But there was a darker side to this transformation. Because Japan was not simply trying to survive. It was trying to become powerful enough that no foreign empire could ever force it to submit again. And that ambition would change the course of Asian history. Japan had opened its doors. What came through them would transform the country forever. Part 3, The Great Transformation. In 1868, Japan crossed a line it could never uncross. The Tokugawa shogunate was gone. And with it, an entire political order that had ruled Japan for more than 2.5 centuries. A new era had begun. The Meiji era. But this was not simply a change of leaders. Japan was about to attempt something extraordinary. It would try to transform itself from a feudal society into a modern industrial nation. In a matter of decades. The new leaders understood the danger. Western empires were expanding across Asia. China was being forced open. India had fallen under British rule. European powers were competing for territory, resources, and influence. Japan had seen what happened to weaker states. It had no intention of becoming the next one. So the government adopted a radical strategy. Learn from the West before the West can dominate you. Japanese officials traveled overseas. They studied European governments. They examined American schools. They investigated factories. They observed modern armies and navies. They studied railways, banking, engineering, medicine, and industrial production. Japan was not trying to become European. It was trying to become strong enough to remain Japanese. And the transformation was astonishing. Railways began connecting major cities. Telegraph lines spread. Factories appeared. Modern schools were established. A national army replaced the old feudal military structure. A modern navy began to take shape. The government introduced new institutions, new laws, and new systems of taxation. Even the appearance of Japanese society began to change. Western-style clothing appeared among government officials. Men who had once worn traditional hairstyles adopted new fashions. The samurai class, once the warrior elite of Japan, was gradually stripped of its special privileges. For centuries, carrying a sword had been a symbol of status. Now that world was disappearing. Some samurai accepted the new order. Others did not. In 1877, thousands of former samurai followed Seigo Takamori in rebellion against the government. The Satsuma Rebellion became the final major armed resistance of the old warrior class. The modern Japanese army defeated them. The age of the samurai was effectively over. But something new was rising in its place. National power. Industrial power. Military power. And Japan soon discovered that modernization could produce results much faster than anyone expected. In 1894, Japan went to war with Qing China. Japan's modern military defeated the once mighty Chinese Empire. The victory shocked the world. Japan was no longer simply defending itself from foreign powers. It had become a regional power in its own right. Then came an even more extraordinary confrontation. In 1904, Japan went to war with the Russian Empire. Russia was one of the largest and most powerful empires on Earth. Its territory stretched across Europe and Asia. Its population dwarfed Japan's. Its military reputation was enormous. And yet, Japan won. The Russo-Japanese War ended in 1905 with Russia's defeat. For many people across Asia, the victory was astonishing. An Asian nation had defeated a major European empire using modern industry, military organization, and technology. Japan had achieved what its leaders had wanted. It had become powerful enough to command respect. But power brought a dangerous temptation. Japan increasingly began to believe that security required expansion. And expansion created an empire. Japan gained control over Taiwan. Its influence over Korea grew. In 1910, Korea was formally annexed by Japan. Japan expanded into parts of China. Then, in the 1930s, military influence over Japanese politics became increasingly powerful. In 1931, Japanese forces seized Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. The international response was strong. But Japan did not retreat. Instead, the country moved deeper into conflict. In 1937, full-scale war with China erupted. What had begun as a strategy of national survival had evolved into imperial expansion. And this is one of the most important contradictions in modern Japanese history. The same modernization that had helped Japan resist foreign domination also gave Japan the industrial and military power to dominate others. Japan had learned the methods of the great empires. And eventually, it began to act like one. The country that had once feared Western imperialism was now building an empire of its own. Military leaders increasingly shaped national policy. Resources became essential. Strategic territory became essential. And the war in China became increasingly difficult to end. By the end of the 1930s, Japan was no longer simply changing. It was moving toward a confrontation with the world's greatest industrial powers. And across the Pacific, another country was watching closely. The United States. Japan had spent decades trying to become strong enough that no foreign power could dictate its future. Now, it was moving toward a war against the very nation whose industrial power could ultimately determine that future. The transformation had succeeded. Japan had become modern. It had become industrial. It had become powerful. But the question was no longer whether Japan could survive in a world dominated by empires. The question was, what would Japan do with its newfound power? And the answer would lead to one of the darkest chapters in its history. Part 4, The Empire, the War, and the Ashes. By the late 1930s, Japan had become one of the most powerful nations in Asia. Its factories were producing weapons. Its navy was among the strongest in the world. Its military controlled vast territories. But power had created a trap. The war in China was consuming enormous resources. Oil was becoming increasingly important. And Japan's leaders feared that without access to raw materials, the country could not sustain its military ambitions. At the same time, Japan was becoming increasingly isolated diplomatically. The United States opposed Japanese expansion in China. Economic pressure intensified. And by 1941, relations between Tokyo and Washington had reached a dangerous breaking point. Japan's leaders faced a decision. Retreat. Or take an enormous gamble. They chose the gamble. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack shocked the United States. Within days, America was fully committed to the Pacific War. At first, Japan achieved a series of stunning victories. Japanese forces moved rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Hong Kong fell. Singapore fell. The Philippines were invaded. Indonesia was occupied. Across a vast region, the Japanese Empire expanded at extraordinary speed. But Japan had awakened a much larger industrial power. The United States could replace ships, build aircraft, produce tanks, train soldiers, and manufacture weapons on a scale Japan could not match. The turning point came in 1942. At Midway, American forces dealt a devastating blow to the Japanese carrier fleet. The momentum began to shift. The war became longer, harder, and increasingly destructive. For civilians across Asia, Japanese expansion brought occupation, forced labor, repression, and enormous suffering. In China, the war had already caused catastrophic losses. Across Korea and other occupied territories, people lived under Japanese colonial rule. And across the Pacific, civilians were caught between invading armies and brutal battles. The war was not simply a clash between governments. It was a human catastrophe. And eventually, the destruction reached Japan itself. American bombing campaigns devastated Japanese cities. Tokyo was hit by one of the most destructive air raids in history. Much of the city was reduced to ruins. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed or left homeless across the bombing campaigns of 1945. Then came August. On August 6, 1945, an American atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The scale of destruction was unlike anything the world had experienced. But the final collapse of Japan involved more than the atomic bombs alone. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan in August 1945. Japanese leaders now faced a rapidly changing strategic situation. The possibility of continued war was becoming almost impossible to sustain. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese public heard something it had never heard before. The voice of Emperor Hirohito. Japan was surrendering. The empire was gone. The war was over. And Japan was devastated. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of people were displaced. Families had been separated. The economy was shattered. The country had lost its empire. And the ideology that had justified expansion had collapsed with it. Japan now faced a question that was almost as difficult as the war itself. What kind of country would it become after defeat? The answer would surprise the world. Japan was occupied by the Allied powers, with the United States playing the dominant role. The old military order was dismantled. Political institutions were transformed. A new constitution came into force in 1947. The emperor remained. But no longer as a sovereign ruler. Japan renounced war as a sovereign right under its new constitution. The country was beginning again. But rebuilding Japan was not going to be easy. The cities were damaged. Food was scarce. The economy was struggling. And millions of people were trying to return to ordinary life after years of war. Then something extraordinary happened. Japan began to rebuild. Factories reopened. Education expanded. Infrastructure improved. American economic support and the Korean War helped stimulate industrial production. Japanese companies began developing products that would eventually become famous around the world. Toyota, Honda, Sony, Panasonic. The transformation accelerated. In 1964, Tokyo hosted the Olympic Games. That same year, Japan opened the Tokaido Shinkansen. The bullet train. It could travel at speeds that seemed almost unimaginable at the time. The message was unmistakable. Japan was no longer defined by the ruins of 1945. It was moving forward. By the 1970s and 1980s, Japanese automobiles, electronics, cameras, televisions, and industrial technology were becoming global symbols of quality. Tokyo became one of the world's great economic capitals. Japan had achieved something remarkable. A country devastated by war had become an economic superpower within a single generation. But beneath the success was another story. The post-war miracle demanded extraordinary discipline. Long working hours. Intense educational competition. Strong social expectations. Rapid urbanization. And a culture in which individual ambition was often balanced against the needs of the group. Japan had rebuilt its cities. It had rebuilt its economy. It had rebuilt its international reputation. But history does not disappear simply because a country becomes prosperous. The memories of war remained. The demographic consequences of modernization were beginning to appear. And the economic machine that had carried Japan to extraordinary heights would eventually encounter a problem it could not solve with factories, technology, or exports. Japan had survived destruction. It had conquered defeat. It had reinvented itself once before. But the next challenge would be far quieter. There would be no invading army. No battleships approaching the coast. No bombs falling from the sky. Instead, Japan would face an enemy growing slowly inside its own society. Time. And the future of Japan would depend on how it answered it. Part 5, The Japan that exists today. Walk through Tokyo today. And it can feel like you have stepped into the future. Trains arrive almost exactly when expected. Towering buildings fill the skyline. Convenience stores seem to exist on every corner. Robots, artificial intelligence, high-speed transportation, and advanced manufacturing are woven into everyday life. Millions of people move through the city every day. And yet, somewhere beyond the skyscrapers, another Japan is slowly disappearing. Drive away from the major cities. You begin to see empty houses. Closed shops. Abandoned schools. And villages where the number of elderly residents far exceeds the number of young people. These abandoned homes have become known as ikeya. Some were once family homes passed from one generation to another. Now they sit empty. Windows covered. Gardens overgrown. Entire buildings waiting for someone who may never come. It is one of the strangest contradictions of modern Japan. A country famous for crowded cities has millions of empty homes. And this reveals something much deeper. Japan is not simply facing an economic problem. It is facing a demographic transformation. For decades, Japan has had one of the world's lowest birth rates. At the same time, people are living longer. The result is a rapidly aging population. There are fewer young people entering the workforce. Fewer children filling rural schools. And an increasing number of elderly people who need support. This creates enormous pressure on the economy, healthcare system, communities, and families. But describing Japan as a country in decline would be too simple. Because even as some parts of the country shrink, other parts continue to reinvent themselves. Tokyo remains one of the world's most important cities. Japanese companies remain leaders in automobiles, robotics, electronics, engineering, and advanced manufacturing. Japanese culture has become one of the country's most powerful global exports. And perhaps nowhere is this more obvious than in the world of entertainment. Anime. Manga. Video games. Japanese cinema. Fashion. Architecture. Design. Food. What was once considered foreign and exotic in the West has become part of everyday global culture. A teenager in Los Angeles can grow up watching Japanese anime. A gamer in New York can spend hundreds of hours inside worlds created by Japanese studios. A chef in London can build an entire menu around Japanese techniques. And millions of people around the world have encountered Japan without ever visiting it. But there is another side to this global popularity. The Japan that the world consumes is often carefully simplified. Samurai. Geisha. Cherry blossoms. Zen temples. Anime. Neon Tokyo. Mount Fuji. It is beautiful. It is fascinating. And it is real. But Japan is much more complicated than its exported image. Take the country's traditional culture. Shinto shrines still stand beside modern cities. Buddhist temples continue traditions that are more than 1,000 years old. Tea ceremonies preserve rituals refined over generations. Traditional crafts survive through artisans who may spend decades mastering a single technique. Festivals still bring communities together. And every spring, millions of people gather beneath cherry blossoms. But some of these traditions face a difficult future. The people who know them best are aging. Young people increasingly move toward major cities. Small communities lose population. And when a village disappears, it can take a language, a craft, a festival, or a centuries-old tradition with it. This is the hidden tension of modern Japan. The country has become exceptionally good at preserving its past, while simultaneously changing faster than many traditional communities can survive. And perhaps this is why Japan's future is so fascinating. Because the country has faced radical transformation before. It happened during the Meiji era. It happened after World War II. And now another transformation is underway. But this time, the challenge is different. Japan is not trying to defeat an invading army. It is not trying to catch up with industrial powers. It is not rebuilding cities destroyed by war. It is trying to adapt to a future with fewer people. An older population. Rapid technological change. And traditions that cannot simply be manufactured once they disappear. Technology may help. Robotics could fill labor shortages. Artificial intelligence could transform industries. Immigration could change the demographic equation. Remote work could bring new life to rural communities. But technology cannot automatically recreate a community. It cannot replace a disappearing festival. It cannot teach an ancient craft to the next generation unless someone is willing to learn. And it cannot preserve a culture simply by putting it inside a museum. That is the real question facing Japan. Not whether it can remain modern. It already is. Not whether it can compete technologically. It has done that for generations. The deeper question is, what does Japan want to preserve while it changes? Because Japan's greatest strength throughout history has been adaptation. It borrowed ideas from China and Korea. It transformed them into something distinctly Japanese. It encountered Western military power. And reinvented its political and economic system. It suffered catastrophic defeat. And rebuilt itself into a peaceful economic superpower. Again and again, Japan changed. But every transformation required something to be left behind. The samurai disappeared. The old feudal order disappeared. The empire disappeared. The post-war economic model changed. And now, another Japan is emerging. Perhaps that is the part of Japan most people never see. Not the country frozen in ancient tradition. Not the futuristic city of science fiction. But a civilization constantly negotiating between its past and its future. And that struggle is happening quietly. In crowded Tokyo train stations. In remote mountain villages. Inside centuries-old temples. Inside technology laboratories. Inside family homes. And inside the lives of millions of people trying to decide what parts of the past should follow them into the future. Japan has changed before. It will change again. The only question is, what will remain when it does?